right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. With us is Mr. Ben Saul. He is the Special Rapporteur in the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. And
rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. It's right now in the press briefing room. Thank you.
And we paused just as the announcement overhead was introducing the Special Rapporteur as well. The Special Rapporteurs, as you know, and independent experts are in New York currently. They are briefing the United Nations Third Committee, which is the committee that looks at human rights issues. This was the Special Rapporteur's first report since he took office. And a reminder again that Special Rapporteurs and independent experts, by their names, are independent, and they carry an independent voice from the United Nations. Sir, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm in New York presenting my report to the General Assembly on the protection of human rights by regional organizations while countering terrorism, from the European Union through to the African Union and in other regions around the world. I also give a bit of an update of events in the last year in countering terrorism. Obviously, the threat of terrorism has continued in many parts of the world, from the Middle East to West Africa to Russia and Pakistan. The victims of terrorism continue to deserve our sympathy and support and meaningful assistance and protection. But the past year also confirms that violations of international law while countering terrorism continue unabated. Violations of human rights and refugee law, humanitarian law and international criminal law, the prohibition on military force in international relations. Although we had a war on terror 20 years ago, it feels like wars on terror are back with a vengeance, along with their catastrophic humanitarian consequences, including support for those wars by states which fail to use their influence to prevent violations of international law by other states. Double standards erode global confidence in the credibility and legitimacy of international law and encourage countries to settle their disputes by violence instead of by international law. Over the past year, I've been concerned about excessive counter-terrorism laws in many countries, which are misused against political activists, civil society, journalists, universities, students, often combined with unfair trials and judiciaries which are not independent. Counterterrorism laws are used to suppress political freedoms of expression, assembly, and association. Sometimes they oppress religious freedom and political participation in government. We've also noticed a phenomenon of what we call transnational repression. That is, the use of counterterrorism laws or the pretext of countering terrorism to pursue often a country's citizens living in another country. So this is sometimes includes harassment and threats, but it's even in some cases included physical attacks and causing death in some cases. I've also been concerned about the misuse of new technologies by governments when countering terrorism, which violates the right to privacy. Spyware, facial recognition software, artificial intelligence to militarily target an enemy, online content moderation of terrorist or extremist content in a way which is excessive and suppresses freedom of expression. Further point to note over the past year is a lack of attention to addressing the root causes of terrorism, or conditions conducive, as the United Nations says, which, according to the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, includes things like protracted unresolved conflict, state violations of human rights, socioeconomic marginalization, political exclusion. And these are factors which are present in many countries, and including in the conflict in the Middle East, which has preoccupied the world over the last year. My current report to the General Assembly really makes positive recommendations to governments and regional organisations on how to better protect human rights within the African Union or the Organisation of American States or the European Union and other regional organisations around the world. I make a few key recommendations. One, to ensure that regional laws do not violate human rights by being too broad and susceptible to abuse by authoritarian and other governments. Secondly, to ensure that when states cooperate through regional organisations, that they respect minimum international safeguards like not returning or extraditing a person to another country where they'll be tortured or get an unfair trial. Ensuring refugee status is protected and not violated to deal with terrorists. Ensuring that when states exchange law enforcement and intelligence data in regional cooperation frameworks, military intelligence policing, that they protect personal data and the right to privacy, and that when they issue arrest warrants for terrorists across a region, that they ensure due process and the protection of courts. Most regional organisations also don't apply a human rights due diligence policy in their cooperation activities, and I think that's a really important step to ensure that before you do anything within a regional organisation, law enforcement or policing or military or intelligence cooperation activities, you make sure you vet it for what would be the human rights risks of those activities and how you can mitigate those risks to prevent violations. The report also recommends that regional organisations establish what we call oversight and accountability mechanisms. Mechanisms where people whose rights are violated can go to get remedies for those violations. They could be human rights systems, they could be human rights commissions or courts at the regional level, they could be ombudspersons, they could be regional parliamentary committees to review these activities. There's a whole range of different types of structures you can establish to ensure that human rights are respected at the regional level. Much more transparency is needed in the activities of regional organisations, so reporting publicly, accessibly on the activities that organisations are involved in, so that these aren't secret and so that the public can have confidence that what these organisations are doing does comply with human rights and public expectations. Part of that is also getting civil society organisations, NGOs and others involved in the oversight of counter-terrorism activities. Finally, I'd just mention that regional organisations need to do more to protect and assist the victims of terrorism as well. And I do recommend the United Nations model law on victims of terrorism, which contains a whole lot of good practices to ensure that regional standards are consistent with the rights of victims to get assistance, protection, compensation, including at the community level in conflicts where whole communities are sometimes victims of terrorism. Final point, and then I'll throw to questions, is just to encourage the Security Council next month to ensure that it renews the humanitarian exemption to counter-terrorism sanctions. So the Security Council has imposed sanctions to prevent the misuse of funds and assets by terrorist groups for the financing of terrorist acts. Historically, this was overbroad because it prevented civilian populations in need, getting humanitarian and medical relief that was essential in conflict areas. Resolution 2664 a few years ago created a humanitarian relief exemption, but it's up for renewal in December, and I want to encourage all states to make sure that they influence Security Council members to renew that resolution so that humanitarian relief can keep getting into conflict situations where it's often desperately needed. Thank you very much.
Let's start right here, and please introduce yourself as well.
My name is Ridwan Karim Dini Osman. I'm a broadcast journalist from Ghana working for the EIB network. I'm also a Dag Hammarskjöld Fellow. I'm sure you are aware that the Sahel region is the most impacted by terrorism in Africa. We've also seen an erosion of democratic trust within the West Africa sub-region. We've seen about 6 coups d'etats in the last 3 years. What will be your assessment in terms of how that has impacted counter-terrorism efforts within the Sahel region? And of course, these countries have also lost faith in organizations like the ECOWAS. And that's why we have Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger withdrawing from the organization. What will be your assessment of that?
Yep. Thank you very much. And yes, of course, West and Central Africa have been heavily affected by religious extremist groups of various kinds in recent years. The situation has been getting worse, including in the so-called coup countries, the 3 countries that have been most prominently affected, and lots of spillover to the Atlantic coast countries, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, in recent years as well. Look, I encourage all countries to seek assistance and cooperation with the international community where that's feasible. That includes not only the United Nations, but of course regional actors as well, whether that's the African Union or ECOWAS, because I think that those institutions can offer valuable assistance to countries in the region to provide a kind of regional solidarity, sometimes to provide military assistance through the various sub-regional and regional mechanisms. We know that to combat terrorism, you need a holistic strategy, right? You can't just have military force or policing. The UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy encourages states to address the root causes of conflict, including by resolving conflicts through negotiations where that's possible, by addressing underdevelopment, poverty, inequality, but importantly also political exclusion and marginalization. In my own view, I don't think that military rule is a positive way to effectively address the threat of terrorism. I think you need a more participatory, inclusive form of governance to ensure that all voices are heard, from minority groups to women and children, and it's got to take all perspectives into account. And if you run a government by military rule, I don't think that gives you the most effective way of addressing terrorism. And I think the fact that the situation in many of these countries has worsened since military rule came, I think is good evidence that it's perhaps not the best way to counter terrorism.
So what would you recommend? What should be the handle on this issue? Because also under the civilian rule in those countries, the security situation was worsening, and that's part of the reasons the military takeovers happened. And so now we have the military takeovers and the situation is worsening. What should be the way forward if you reckon that under the military regime, the security situation will not get any better than what happens? Because democracy didn't also yield the results as well. I mean, from what the people are saying.
Yeah, look, there's no simple answer to terrorism, but I think that what you do need is an inclusive, participatory political process that draws in all relevant actors in the country to come to a common understanding of the need to address the threat. Even well-functioning democracies can be heavily affected by terrorism, right? But it doesn't mean that there's some other solution that's better, right? And I think, as I suggested, shifting to a highly militarized approach has not been successful. And in addition, it's also involved some pretty serious violations of international law as well. Having inviting certain foreign forces in who aren't well known for respect of international humanitarian law and human rights law. I think that's a recipe for alienating communities who are victims of those kinds of violations. In some of these countries over the last year, we've been tracking the kinds of fighting that's going on, and we've seen many examples of indiscriminate attacks on villages and the killing of civilians, indiscriminate aerial bombardment in some cases. That's not an effective counterterrorism strategy. That's just killing your own people. And we know that more targeted, discriminate, proportionate military interventions are the way to win public support. And if you win public support, that helps feed you intelligence, because communities are willing to cooperate if they see that you're providing security for them. If you start indiscriminately bombing their villages, why wouldn't some of them then turn to terrorism or armed groups themselves? We know that state violations of human rights are a key driver of radicalization and further violence. So it's no surprise that actually the situation is getting worse in some countries.
Thank you. My name is Justicia Shipena. I'm a reporter for Eagle FM, and I'm also a Dag Hammarskjöld's fellow. I wanted to find out, in terms of bilateral treaties, have you done any work on countries and how bilateral extradition treaties incorporate that human rights protection? And when we do speak of extraditions, what considerations should be made for countries' extradition requests that are involving refugees or asylum seekers accused of terrorism-related offenses? As we have seen, the issue when it comes to asylum seekers in the African region is one of the ongoing debates. We're looking that of, especially when you look at the UK and the asylum situation with sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. So I just wanted to find out from you, have you done any work on that? And also, when we do speak of financial terrorism, this is also a growing threat in the African region. And what have you found in this regard? Have you looked at how financial terrorism is affecting human rights? Of course, my country, Namibia, as well as South Africa, face that grey listing and are trying to meet those requirements by the AFTAF. And just want to get from you if you had a look in terms of that financial terrorism as well as human rights.
Thank you for your questions. In extradition treaties, many of them have some standard human rights safeguard clauses in them. So in particular, many have what we call a non-discrimination clause, which means that you can't send someone back to another country if they would be persecuted or discriminated against in the foreign country. So that's one example. Another example is sometimes a fair trial guarantee clause. So again, you can't send someone back if they would be denied justice in the foreign country. What I recommend, and this is a recommendation I make in the regional organizations report as well in relation to extradition, is that there should always be full protection of what we call the principle of non-refoulement, which is the obligation not to return a person by any means, including extradition, to a country where they would face arbitrary deprivation of life, number one. Number two, torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. Number three, deprivation of a fair trial. So some of these kind of key human rights safeguards, which you should never return a person to face a risk of violation. In terms of refugees, asylum, look, international refugee law has provisions in it to balance refugee status and security considerations. So Article 1F of the Refugee Convention allows for the exclusion of people who have committed an international crime, like a war crime or crime against humanity, or serious non-political crimes, and those often include terrorism, to the extent that terrorism is defined as, for example, attacks on civilians, right? So if you murder civilians innocent civilians, for political reasons or for religious reasons or whatever, many, refugee law would broadly speaking regard that as a person not entitled to refugee status. There are then some exceptions to the principle of non-refoulement in relation to persecution if you present certain kinds of security risks, so Article 33 of the Refugee Convention. And then there's another one, an expulsion clause under Article 32. Essentially, these are ways of managing security risks. The interpretation of those provisions is quite strict, as you could imagine, because the aim is to ensure you protect people who are genuinely refugees, while at the same time ensuring that there is adequate consideration for security needs of states. On the Rwanda deal, look, that's outside my mandate in terms of counterterrorism. I can tell you, though, that it was, the new British government has abandoned that scheme, and I think that's right from a human rights standpoint. It was borrowed from my country, actually, Australia, which pioneered shipping refugees offshore to other countries to process them. So, these plans weren't to send people back to persecution, but it was to process them outside the country to make it less attractive to come to those countries if you knew, you'd be detained for prolonged periods, and then you might not resettle in the UK or Australia, you might go somewhere else. So I think, broadly speaking, they're certainly not consistent with the spirit of the Refugee Convention and possibly the text. On financial, terrorist financing, so the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, you mentioned, conducts these assessments of countries to ensure, to determine if, their financial systems have sufficient integrity in relation to combating money laundering and terrorist financing, and if they don't meet the standards, then they can be grey or blacklisted, which can lead to some pretty severe economic consequences for the economies of those countries. I think FATF is, in principle, pretty sensitive to the effects of that, and so it's not a process they enter into lightly, and they try to do it in a way which is collaborative and constructive and works with the country to help improve its financial system. Having said that, we have been concerned, for example, about the way FATF standards have adversely impacted on not-for-profit organizations. So in implementing FATF standards, too many countries, certainly in the past, viewed NGOs, civil society organizations, as a terrorist financing risk when they weren't. And actually, the FATF standards themselves said most NGOs are not at risk of terrorist financing at all. You should take a risk-based approach to just look at the small number of NGOs that may present risks of terrorist financing. But in practice, that message wasn't well understood. Last year, FATF revised Recommendation 8, which is the recommendation dealing with the regulation of not-for-profits, and strengthen the protection of not-for-profit activity, so that you're not, so that countries aren't deregistering or refusing to register NGOs, working on humanitarian relief in the conflict in Somalia, for example, which then has really adverse effects on the ability of civilians to obtain humanitarian relief in those areas. So it's getting better, but it's still a work in progress because there's a lot more to be done to fix the way that national implementation of those standards plays out in a lot of countries.
Thank you very much. Let's go online. I see that there is a hand raised.
Yes, thank you.
And if you don't mind introducing yourself, please.
Yes, of course. Haneen, journalist from Occupied Palestine, Dag Hammarskjöld Fellow. I would like to ask about the context in the West Bank regarding the assaults and the crimes committed by Israeli settlers in Palestinian cities and villages. For example, the murder and burning of the child Muhammad Abu Khdeir in Jerusalem in 2014 and burning of the Wabshir family in a village near Nablus in 2015 and many others, and the violence not stopped. How do you monitor the crimes of settlers within the context of counter-terrorism? Also, this leads me to a second question about state-sponsored terrorism, especially regarding Israel, especially since it does not prevent settlers from committing their crimes, as well as the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Will you be following up on your reports on human rights, on the human rights situation in Palestine, in light of the terrorism sponsored and committed by Israel?
Thank you. Good questions. And on the West Bank and settler crimes, like many other human rights mechanisms, I've been long concerned about the seeming impunity for settler violence in the West Bank. A number of countries have imposed sanctions on some extremist settlers precisely for the kind of violence that they've been committing for a very long time. The settlements are illegal. The International Court of Justice said so again in the recent advisory opinion on the occupied territories. It's as the occupier of the Palestinian territories, Israel has an obligation to suppress any violence against civilians by anyone, including Israeli settlers. And unfortunately, there have been too many incidents where Israeli forces have been passive, standing by, not responding, when settler crimes have been committed, and certainly not pursuing accountability as is its obligation under the law of occupation and international humanitarian law. So I'm alarmed by the growth of settler crimes in the last year, as well as you mentioned, historically. In terms of Israel's conduct more broadly in Gaza and Palestine, where to start? The key for me is the application of international humanitarian law. Israel has obligations under both the law of occupation as well as in relation to Gaza, the law on the conduct of hostilities under international humanitarian law. I and other special procedures over the last year have issued many statements about Israel's conduct, including, in our view, what amounts to a pattern of deliberate, indiscriminate, and disproportionate attacks harming large numbers of civilians, the use of high explosive munitions in densely populated areas which of their nature cannot distinguish between civilians and military targets, denial of humanitarian relief, and the use of starvation seemingly as a weapon of war. We support the process before the International Criminal Court with an independent court being able to examine allegations of international crimes, including war crimes and crimes against humanity against Israel. We've called for all states to fulfill their obligation to ensure respect for humanitarian law by Israel as a party to the Geneva Conventions. We've called on all states not to provide weapons or munitions to Israel because that would breach the obligation of other states to ensure respect for humanitarian law. It would breach obligations under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide, and it would breach, for parties to the Arms Trade Treaty, their obligations not to provide weapons to another state where they would be used to commit violations of international law. So humanitarian consequences in Gaza are well known, over 40,000 killed, 100,000 injured, the destruction or damage of most public infrastructure and residential buildings in Gaza, the destruction of any possibility of ordinary social life. And unfortunately, Israel hasn't taken the message from the Security Council, the International Court of Justice, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, many governments, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council. I mean, these are all mechanisms which have called on Israel to respect international law, and unfortunately, it's still not heeding that message.
Are there any additional questions in the room or online? Oh, Abdelhamid, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Abdelhamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. And I want to follow up with my colleague Haneen questions about state-sponsored terrorism and the thin line between national liberation movement and terrorism, because there have been so much confusion about it. And I want to ask you about the international community have not agreed on one single definition of what is international terrorism. Now, where is the thin line you see between national liberation movement and their right to resist occupation and foreign domination and what is called terrorism? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. And you're right, there is no internationally accepted definition of terrorism. The General Assembly is still negotiating a treaty over the last 20 plus years to come up with a definition. The Security Council has a model definition, but it's not binding on states, and it hasn't really influenced much state practice. In my office, for many years, has had a model definition of terrorism, but the question of the line between national liberation and terrorism, to my mind, looks like this. Yes, there is a right under international law of a people subject to occupation or colonialism to forcibly resist an occupier who itself forcibly represses the right of self-determination. At the same time, that right to resist has to be exercised in accordance with international humanitarian law. So yes, national liberation, self-determination is a just cause. But in the same way that national self-defense of a state is a just cause, if a country is attacked, it doesn't mean it can fight back by murdering civilians. And the same is true of national liberation and self-determination. Yes, it's a just cause, but you have to do it in the right way. And you can't murder civilians or deliberately attack civilians or take hostages in order to claim you're fighting for self-determination. Those are red lines in international law for everybody, states and non-state actors alike. In terms of the state terrorism question, yeah, look, for me, actually I don't find the terrorism language very helpful, precisely because there is no internationally agreed legal concept of it. And so it doesn't help you very much, other than just as a form of political labeling and maybe stigmatizing whoever you're calling a terrorist. For me, what matters legally is that we already have international criminal law and international humanitarian law, which applies to all sides, state and non-state, in the same way. So that if a state murders civilians, it's a war crime by state forces, just as it is if a liberation movement does the same thing. So I think those are the common rules which bind everybody. Likewise, crimes against humanity can be committed by states or non-state actors alike. Everybody agrees those are crimes under international law. They're well defined. There are courts like the International Criminal Court which can prosecute them, unlike terrorism. I mean, no international court has jurisdiction over terrorism. So it just doesn't help you. It doesn't give you anything which international law, criminal law doesn't already give you. And those crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, are crimes of universal jurisdiction. So it also gives a power to every other country in the international system to prosecute them wherever they're committed, anywhere in the world. And again, you don't get that if you call something terrorism. So for me as a lawyer, I'd rather people focus on enforcing international criminal law, encouraging all countries to investigate and prosecute and put in jail anybody, state or non-state actor, who commits war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide.
I don't see any other questions in the room or online. In that case, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and thanks to you, Special Rapporteur.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.